My name is Robert Mitchell, and in the summer of 1963, I was a 24-year-old white man working at my father's construction company in Birmingham, Alabama, when I fell in love with a woman who would change everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and what it meant to stand up for what's right. Her name was Grace Washington, and she was the most intelligent, beautiful, and courageous person I had ever met. She was also black, which in the segregated South of 1963 made our relationship not just socially unacceptable but literally dangerous. What I didn't anticipate was that the greatest threat to our love wouldn't come from the Ku Klux Klan, angry mobs, or even the police. It would come from my own father, who would ultimately fire me from the family business and disown me rather than accept that his son had chosen love over the racial prejudices that had defined our family for generations. I grew up believing that my father, William Mitchell Sr., was one of the most respected men in Birmingham. Mitchell Construction had been building homes and commercial buildings throughout Alabama since the 1920s, and our family name was synonymous with quality work and business integrity. What I didn't understand until much later was that my father's success had been built on the foundation of segregation. He paid black workers significantly less than white workers, refused to hire black supervisors regardless of their qualifications, and maintained separate facilities and equipment for workers based on their race. "Son, this is just how business works in the South," he would tell me when I occasionally questioned why all our crew leaders were white despite some of our most skilled workers being black. "You don't mess with the natural order of things if you want to succeed." My awakening to the realities of racial injustice began slowly, through small observations that gradually accumulated into larger questions about the world I had grown up in. I noticed that our black workers always ate lunch separately, used different bathrooms, and were never promoted beyond basic labor positions no matter how long they had worked for us. I saw how my father spoke differently to white clients than to the few black customers who could afford our services, treating the latter with barely concealed condescension despite their money being the same color as everyone else's. Most disturbing of all, I began to recognize the fear in the eyes of our black employees when they interacted with white supervisors, a constant vigilance that suggested they were always aware of occupying a precarious position in a system designed to keep them subordinate. The moment that changed everything occurred on a scorching Tuesday morning in June 1963, when I was supervising the construction of a new office building downtown. One of our most experienced workers, an older black man named Samuel Washington, had suffered a heart attack while carrying heavy lumber in the oppressive heat. As I rushed to help him, calling for someone to get medical assistance, I was shocked to discover that the nearest hospital, University Hospital, where white patients were treated, was only 3 blocks away. But the ambulance that arrived was taking Samuel to the colored hospital across town, a 20-minute drive through Birmingham traffic. "Please," I begged the white ambulance drivers, "University Hospital is right there. He needs immediate medical attention." The driver's response was cold and matter-of-fact. "Sorry, son, but that's not how things work. Colored patients go to colored hospitals. That's the law." I watched helplessly as they loaded Samuel into the ambulance for the long journey across town, knowing that every minute of delay could mean the difference between life and death. That evening, I learned that Samuel Washington had died en route to the hospital, and I couldn't escape the feeling that he might have survived if the color of his skin hadn't determined which medical facility could treat him. Samuel's funeral was my first experience in a black church, and it was there that I met his daughter Grace, who had come home from Fisk University in Nashville to bury her father. Grace was everything that my segregated upbringing had never prepared me to encounter, a black woman who was not only stunningly beautiful but also intellectually brilliant, politically aware, and completely unintimidated by the social conventions that were supposed to keep us in separate worlds. "Mr. Mitchell," she said when I approached her after the service to express my condolences, "I appreciate your presence here, but I have to ask, what are you planning to do to ensure that what happened to my father never happens to another worker?" Her question hit me like a physical blow because it forced me to confront my own complicity in the system that had killed her father. I had witnessed the discrimination, accepted the excuses, and continued to benefit from a business model that treated black workers as expendable. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "But I want to do something. I want to make things right." Grace's response was both challenging and hopeful. Then maybe we should talk about what making things right actually means. Because good intentions without action are just another form of racism. The conversations that followed over the next several weeks opened my eyes to aspects of the civil rights struggle that I had never understood from my privileged position as a white man in the South. Grace was deeply involved in the movement, having participated in sit-ins at lunch counters in Nashville and voter registration drives in rural Tennessee. She explained how the violence I had seen on television, the police dogs, fire hoses, and brutal arrests during the Birmingham campaign earlier that spring was not an aberration, but the logical extension of the everyday discrimination that made Black Americans second-class citizens in their own country. "Robert, you seem like a decent person," Grace told me during one of our clandestine meetings at a coffee shop in the Black section of town. "But decency isn't enough anymore. Black people in this country have been waiting for white people to develop basic human decency for over a century. We can't wait any longer. Either you're part of the solution, or you're part of the problem. There's no neutral ground in a moral crisis." Her words forced me to examine not just my own beliefs, but my family's legacy and my future role in perpetuating or challenging the systems that had shaped my comfortable life. As our relationship deepened from intellectual discussions to genuine romantic attraction, I began to understand that loving Grace meant more than simply overcoming my own racial prejudices. It meant being willing to sacrifice the security and social acceptance that my whiteness had always provided. In 1963 Alabama, interracial relationships were not only illegal but could result in violence, imprisonment, or worse. "If we pursue this," Grace warned me during one of our evening walks through her neighborhood, "you need to understand that you'll lose everything: your family, your job, your place in white society. And there's no guarantee that Black society will ever fully accept you either. You'll be caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Before you continue this incredible journey of love, courage, and moral awakening with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the individuals who risked everything to stand up for love and justice during America's most challenging historical moments." Despite the warnings and the very real dangers we faced, Grace and I found ourselves drawn together by a connection that transcended racial boundaries and social conventions. Our relationship was conducted in secret, meeting in locations where we were unlikely to be recognized by anyone who might report us to authorities or threaten our safety. We would drive to remote parks outside the city, meet at her apartment when her neighbors were at work, or gather with a small group of interracial couples who were navigating similar challenges within the civil rights community. The intellectual and emotional intimacy that developed between us was unlike anything I had experienced in my previous relationships with white women who had been chosen for me based on social compatibility rather than genuine connection. Grace challenged my assumptions about everything: politics, religion, family, career, and the meaning of success and happiness. "You've lived your entire life accepting other people's definitions of who you should be and what you should want," she observed during one of our lengthy conversations about the future. "But love requires you to decide for yourself what kind of person you want to become." The moment when our secret relationship would inevitably be discovered came sooner than we had hoped, when a business associate of my father's spotted us having dinner together at a restaurant in the Black section of Birmingham. Within hours, the news had reached my father, who summoned me to his office the next morning with a fury I had never seen before. "Robert, I've just heard the most disturbing rumor about you," he said, his voice controlled but clearly containing rage. "Please tell me that you have not been seen publicly with a Negro woman, because if that's true, you've not only embarrassed this family but endangered everything we've worked to build." My father's reaction to my relationship with Grace revealed the depth of his commitment to racial segregation and his willingness to sacrifice his own son rather than challenge the social order that had provided our family with prosperity and status. "Son, I don't care if you have some physical attraction to colored women," he said, his disgust barely contained. "Men have needs, and I understand that. But what I will not tolerate is you treating a Negro as if she were your social equal, appearing in public with her as if this were some kind of legitimate relationship. That ends now, or your employment with this company ends permanently." The ultimatum forced me to confront the choice I had been avoiding since my relationship with Grace began: I could preserve my family relationships and financial security by ending my involvement with the woman I loved. Or I could stand up for my principles and accept the consequences of choosing love over racial prejudice. Dad, I love Grace Washington, and I'm not going to stop seeing her because you disapprove of her race, I told him, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. She's the most remarkable woman I've ever met, and if you can't accept that, then maybe it's your problem, not mine. The explosion that followed my declaration was everything I had feared and more. My father's face turned red with a combination of rage and what I recognized as genuine shock that his son could reject everything he had taught me about racial superiority and social order. "You have lost your mind," he shouted, standing up from behind his desk and pointing his finger at me like a weapon. "That woman has filled your head with communist propaganda and turned you against your own family. I will not have a son who disgraces the Mitchell name by consorting with Negroes as if they were white people." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of my father's racist beliefs and his complete inability to see black people as fully human. He spoke about Grace as if she were a predatory animal who had somehow bewitched me into betraying my racial loyalty, refusing to acknowledge that she might be an intelligent, accomplished woman worthy of love and respect. "Son, you don't understand how these people operate," he insisted. "They use sex and manipulation to get close to white men with money and status. She's not interested in you. She's interested in what you can give her and her people." My attempts to explain Grace's actual background, her university education, her middle-class family, her involvement in the civil rights movement, only increased my father's fury as he interpreted my defense of her as further evidence of how completely I had been brainwashed by civil rights propaganda. "I don't care if she has a dozen college degrees," he declared. "She's still a Negro, and Negroes know their place in civilized society. The fact that she's convinced you to throw away your future for her proves that she's exactly the kind of troublemaker who's trying to destroy everything good about the South." The business implications of my relationship became clear when my father explained how our company's contracts and reputation depended on maintaining the approval of white customers and suppliers who would never tolerate doing business with a firm associated with race mixing. "Robert, Mitchell Construction exists because white people trust us to maintain their standards and values," he said. "If word gets out that my son is romantically involved with a Negro woman, we'll lose every major contract we have. I've spent 40 years building this business, and I will not let you destroy it for some juvenile infatuation." The threat to fire me was not merely about employment. It was about cutting me off from the only life I had ever known, the financial security that my family's success had provided, and the social connections that defined my identity within Birmingham's white community. "If you continue this relationship," my father announced, "you are no longer my son, and you are no longer welcome in this company or this family. I'll make sure that no construction firm in Alabama will hire you, and every bank in Birmingham will know that you're not to be trusted with credit or business relationships." The personal dimension of the conflict was even more painful than the professional consequences, as I watched my father's disappointment transform into a cold rejection that seemed to erase 24 years of love and shared experiences. "I raised you to be a leader in this community, someone who would continue the family legacy with honor and respect," he said, his voice now controlled but distant. "Instead, you've chosen to throw away everything I've given you for a woman who represents everything that's wrong with this country today. I don't know who you are anymore, but you're not the son I thought I raised." My mother's reaction was equally devastating but expressed through tears and emotional manipulation rather than anger. "Robert, honey, you're breaking my heart," she pleaded when I tried to explain my position. "This isn't who you are. You're a good Southern boy from a respectable family. This Negro woman has confused you somehow, made you think that love means abandoning your own people. But love doesn't ask you to destroy your family and your future. Real love makes you a better person, not a person who brings shame on everyone who cares about you." The isolation that followed my confrontation with my parents was immediate and total. Word of my relationship with Grace spread quickly through Birmingham's white community, resulting in the loss of friendships, social invitations, and business relationships that I had taken for granted throughout my life. Former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to me, My fraternity brothers from the University of Alabama refused to acknowledge my existence, and white women I had dated previously treated me as if I had become contaminated by some invisible disease. The economic consequences were swift and severe. My father made good on his threat to fire me, and his influence in the construction industry meant that no other building company would offer me employment. Banks that had once been eager to extend credit to a Mitchell suddenly found reasons to deny me loans or business relationships. "I'm sorry, Robert," one bank president explained during a particularly humiliating meeting, "but your recent lifestyle choices have made you a poor credit risk. We can't do business with someone whose judgment appears to be so severely compromised." Grace's response to my family's rejection and the economic pressure we were facing revealed both her strength and her deep understanding of what sacrificing white privilege actually meant for someone in my position. "Robert, I need you to understand something," she said during one of our meetings after my firing. "This is just the beginning. The pressure is going to get worse, not better. Are you prepared for a life where you're never fully accepted by white society but also never completely trusted by black society? Because that's what loving me means in 1963 Alabama. The practical challenges of surviving as a social outcast in Birmingham forced me to develop skills and perspectives I had never needed during my privileged upbringing. I found work with a small black-owned construction company whose owner, James Turner, was willing to hire me despite the risks to his own business. "Son, I don't know why you're choosing to walk this hard road," Turner told me on my first day. "But if you're serious about standing with us instead of against us, then we'll see what kind of man you really are when things get difficult." Working alongside black construction workers as their equal rather than their supervisor was an education in both practical skills and social dynamics that my privileged background had never provided. I learned not only how to perform physical labor without the cushion of management authority but also how to navigate the complex social codes that govern interracial interactions in the workplace. My coworkers were initially suspicious of my motivations and capabilities, understandably wondering whether I was genuinely committed to racial equality or simply slumming temporarily before returning to my comfortable white world. The process of earning respect and acceptance within the black community was challenging but ultimately rewarding in ways that my previous success in white society had never been. Unlike the automatic deference I had received because of my family name and social position, the respect I gained from black coworkers and Grace's friends was based on my actual character, work ethic, and commitment to justice rather than inherited privilege. "You're starting to understand what the rest of us have always known," Grace observed as I described my experiences working for Turner Construction. "Respect that you earn through your own actions means more than respect that you inherit through accident of birth." The relationship between Grace and me deepened as we navigated the challenges of building a life together in a society that was determined to prevent interracial love from succeeding. We found strength in small communities of civil rights activists, progressive clergy, and other interracial couples who provided emotional support and practical assistance for people who were choosing love over social convention. "We're not just building a relationship," Grace explained to me during one of our discussions about the future. "We're helping to build a new kind of America where love doesn't have to ask permission from racist laws and traditions." The personal growth I experienced through my relationship with Grace and my integration into Birmingham's black community challenged every assumption I had held about identity, success, and the meaning of family loyalty. I began to understand that my true family was not necessarily the people who shared my blood but the people who shared my values, and that real success meant living according to my principles rather than accumulating wealth and status through compromised integrity. "You're becoming the man you were always meant to be," Grace told me during one of our evening conversations. "But you had to lose everything you thought you wanted in order to discover what you actually needed." The year that followed my break with my family was the most difficult and most transformative period of my life, as I learned to navigate a world where my whiteness no longer provided automatic advantages but where my commitment to racial justice remained suspect to many in the black community who had been betrayed by well-meaning white allies in the past. The work I was doing with Turner Construction was physically demanding and poorly paid compared to my previous position, but it provided me with a sense of purpose and authenticity that my privileged life had never offered. Grace and I made the decision to leave Birmingham in early 1964, recognizing that the hostility we faced in Alabama would make it impossible to build a life together while remaining in a city where segregation was so deeply entrenched. Our destination was Detroit, where Grace had accepted a teaching position and where the automotive industry provided opportunities for skilled construction workers regardless of their controversial romantic relationships. "We're not running away," Grace insisted as we planned our departure. "We're moving toward a place where we can build something positive instead of just surviving something negative." The journey north was itself an education in the geography of American racism, as we discovered that prejudice and discrimination were not uniquely Southern phenomena but national realities that took different forms in different regions. Hotels that would serve us in Ohio might refuse service in Kentucky, while restaurants that welcomed interracial couples in some Michigan cities maintained subtle but effective forms of segregation in others. The difference, Grace explained as we navigated these challenges, is that Northern racism often hides behind politeness and legal technicalities, while Southern racism is honest about its intentions. Our arrival in Detroit in the spring of 1964 coincided with the peak of the Civil Rights Movement. As the Civil Rights Act was making its way through Congress and demonstrations were occurring daily in cities across the country, Grace immediately became involved with local civil rights organizations, while I found work with a construction company that was building housing in Detroit's expanding black neighborhoods. The opportunity to contribute to positive change rather than simply surviving persecution gave our relationship a sense of purpose that strengthened our commitment to each other and to the larger struggle for racial justice. The wedding ceremony that Grace and I finally held in the fall of 1964 was a celebration not just of our love but of the principle that human connection should transcend racial boundaries. The service was conducted by Reverend James Wadsworth, a black minister who had been active in the civil rights movement, and attended by a racially mixed group of friends and allies who had supported us through the difficult transition from Birmingham to Detroit. "Today we celebrate not just the union of Robert and Grace," Reverend Wadsworth declared, "but the possibility of an America where love is stronger than hate, where justice is more powerful than tradition, and where the content of our character matters more than the color of our skin." The absence of my family from our wedding was painful but not unexpected, as they had maintained their position that my relationship with Grace was a betrayal of everything they had taught me about proper behavior and social responsibility. My mother had written one letter, expressing her continued love for me while making clear that she could not accept Grace as a daughter-in-law or attend a ceremony that violated everything she believed about racial separation. "I will always love you, Robert," she wrote, "but I cannot pretend to approve of choices that bring shame to our family name and contradict everything we've taught you about right and wrong." The process of building a new life in Detroit required both Grace and me to develop independence from the families and communities that had shaped our early identities while creating new forms of support and belonging within the civil rights community. Grace's work as a teacher in Detroit's public schools allowed her to contribute directly to the education and advancement of black children, while my construction work helped provide housing for families who were moving north as part of the Great Migration from the segregated South. The personal satisfaction I found in work that served a positive social purpose contrasted sharply with the empty materialism that had characterized my privileged life in Birmingham. Building homes for working-class families, many of whom were escaping the same kind of racial oppression that had threatened Grace and me, felt like genuine accomplishment in ways that managing my father's business never had. "You're finally using your skills and privileges for something that matters," Grace observed as I described my work. "You're helping to build the world you want to live in instead of just accepting the world you inherited." The broader civil rights movement provided context and community for our personal struggle against racism, as we participated in demonstrations, voter registration drives, and educational programs that were working to dismantle the legal and social structures of segregation. Our interracial marriage became a symbol of the movement's goals, demonstrating that racial integration was not just a political abstraction but a personal reality that could be achieved through courage and commitment. The news that reached us from Birmingham throughout 1964 and 1965 confirmed that we had made the right decision to leave, as the violence and resistance to civil rights continued to make the city dangerous for anyone who challenged racial orthodoxy. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in September 1963 had killed 4 young black girls, while the brutal suppression of voting rights demonstrations had drawn national attention to Alabama's determination to maintain white supremacy through violence and intimidation. The relationship with my family remained severed for several years, though I continued to hope that time and changing social attitudes might eventually allow for reconciliation. The passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965 created legal frameworks for racial equality that began to shift public opinion even in the South, making positions like my father's seem increasingly outdated and morally indefensible. The birth of our first child, Martin, in 1966 forced me to confront questions about identity, heritage, and belonging that our relationship had raised but not fully resolved. Our son would grow up in a world where interracial marriage was legal throughout the United States, but he would also face the challenge of defining himself in a society that often demanded racial classification and could be hostile to people who didn't fit neatly into established categories. Martin will have opportunities that neither of us had, Grace reflected as we discussed our hopes and fears for our son's future. But he'll also face challenges that are uniquely his own. We have to prepare him to be proud of all aspects of his heritage while being realistic about the prejudices he might encounter from people who can't understand that love creates families that transcend racial boundaries. The gradual reconciliation with my mother began in 1968, when she wrote to inform me of my father's death from a heart attack. Her letter included a tentative invitation to attend the funeral and an acknowledgement that her grandchild deserved to know his family history, even if she still couldn't fully accept the choices that had created him. "Your father never changed his mind about your marriage," she wrote, "but in his final years, he sometimes wondered if he had been too harsh in cutting you off completely. Perhaps it's time for us to find a way to be family again, even if we still disagree about some things." The funeral was my first return to Birmingham since leaving in 1964. And the experience was both painful and healing as I encountered people who had known me before my transformation and struggled to reconcile the person I had become with their memories of who I used to be. Some former friends and business associates maintained their distance, while others expressed curiosity about my life in Detroit and even admiration for the courage it had taken to follow my convictions despite the personal costs. The legacy of my decision to choose love over racial prejudice ultimately extended far beyond my personal happiness to include contributions to the broader struggle for civil rights and racial justice. Grace and I became advocates for interracial families, working with organizations that provided support and resources for couples and children navigating the complexities of racial identity in American society. The construction company that Grace and I eventually established in Detroit specialized in affordable housing for working-class families, allowing us to use our skills and resources to address the housing discrimination that remained widespread even after the passage of civil rights legislation. "We're building more than houses," I often told our employees. "We're building communities where people can live together regardless of race, creating the integrated society that the civil rights movement envisioned." Looking back on the decision that changed my life, I understand that losing my father's approval and my family's business was actually a form of liberation that allowed me to discover who I really was beneath the expectations and prejudices that had been imposed on me since birth. The man who was fired for dating a black woman during the civil rights era ultimately found a life of greater purpose, deeper love, and more authentic success than anything my privileged upbringing could have provided. Grace and I proved that love truly could overcome the racial barriers that seemed insurmountable in 1963 Alabama, and our marriage became part of the larger transformation that gradually made America a more just and inclusive society. The sacrifice of my father's approval was painful but temporary, while the love I found with Grace and the family we built together provided happiness and meaning that have lasted a lifetime.